next issue that we want to cover is recoil control. A lot of people, when they start shooting, and those follow-up shots aren't nearly as fast as they'd like them to be, or you do get the shots downrange as fast as you'd like, but the hits are all over the place. A lot of times we're asked, how do you recover the recoil? How do you really manage that impulse that you receive from the weapon, as well as, more importantly, that muzzle rise or that muzzle flip? We want to talk about how we do that. Well, first off, it starts with a good grip. Your grip is the most crucial part to recoil control. Your stance is very important as well, but your grip is just paramount. And a couple of things to remember. The more traction, the more friction that we have from our hand onto this firearm, the less movement it will allow. Okay, so if I'm here, if I have my thumb in the incorrect position and my hand's covering it, I'm missing a whole lot of surface area there. And that surface area that I'm missing is going to allow for movement. That's excess movement. I want this thing to be as tight as I can get it. So I get my thumb up and out of the way, settle my other hand into place, settle my thumbs, and get a good squeeze. Now, you'll hear different competition shooters especially say, you've got a 80% squeeze with this hand and a 20% squeeze with your shooting hand, or 60-40 or whatever. How do you know what percentage that is? Can you squeeze 60%, 80%? I can't. What I like to do is I squeeze with my left hand so tight that the firearm shakes, and then I let go until it stops shaking. So I squeeze pretty much with both hands until that front sight is really kind of tremoring, and then I let go just enough to where it's no longer shaking. I really put a lot of conscious effort into squeezing this entire hand. Okay, my non-shooting hand. My shooting hand, if you're really squeezing it as hard as you can, like you're trying to crush a Coke can, the problem is you're going to be shaking a lot, and your trigger press is going to be all over the place. So I try to put more emphasis on this hand, but I'm squeezing it, like I'm trying to hurt it, really. You'll hear me say to new shooters a lot of times, stop choking the firearm. That's because they're squeezing it so hard with both hands that the gun is trembling, that front sight is shaking all over the place. That's no good, and normally that results in poor trigger control. So I will normally squeeze, especially with my left hand, as hard as I need to. That's step two. Step one being enough maximum coverage of the weapon with a good grip, good friction. You got good positive traction on the firearm, and then a good squeeze on the firearm as well. Now, equally important to talk more about that traction, that friction, is your leverage. We talked about if we were only holding the gun right here and somebody was pressing the trigger, then that muzzle rise is going to stop it. It's going to really be out of control. Because of leverage. Archimedes once said that you give me a lever long enough and a place to stand, I can move the world. It's true. The leverage becomes crucial there. So as I'm holding this firearm, the leverage right here is just insane. Well, as I get higher up this direction, I'm counterbalancing that. Okay, think about a seesaw. You're putting another fulcrum point back here. Well, now it's going to be much harder. So now I've got a much more firm grip. Now think about it like this also. Because of a semi-automatic's operation, the slide has to go back. Okay, there's nothing we can do about that. The gun has to cycle. But what we can do, so we can't get directly behind it to prevent it. That would be ideal. Or holding it from the front would somehow be ideal, because that would really keep the muzzle down. Unfortunately, that's obviously not possible. So instead, if you think about what happens when this gun cycles, not only is the muzzle going up, but look right here. This part goes forward. Right? So this part goes forward. If we can minimize that, then that muzzle can't go up anymore. So when I'm getting that good 45-degree angle with my non-shooting hand, I'm really squeezing as hard as I can at the bottom of that to make sure that I've got a good positive grip on the bottom two grooves of this grip. Okay? I really want to control this part of the firearm to control that muzzle from rising up too much. I really want to get a good counterbalancing pressure there to prevent it from rising. That's just basic leverage. That's just science. So, understanding the fundamentals of good positive traction on the firearm, friction between your hand and the weapon, get your thumb out of the way, up, grip, down here, okay, good solid grip. Next, having a good squeeze, having good leverage on the firearm, both as high as you can get on the back of the weapon and a good squeeze down here, good leverage points. And then lastly, the wrist and the elbows have to be in the right position. Now, you've heard us talk about stance. Now, some people say stance isn't important because, if you're using a good stance, you're not utilizing cover correctly. Well, the grip is always just paramount. So when we're here, we need to have a good positive grip our wrist needs to be at that 45-degree angle. You'll hear me say to new shooters, finger check. What I mean by that is they need to be able to take their fingers down at a 45-degree angle. Okay? That means I've got a good angle with this wrist. That means that I'm not absorbing the shock. You know, if I'm here, I see a lot of people do this, and this left thumb is almost straight up. This means I'm absorbing the recoil, the muzzle rise, in the bend of my wrist. That's not where I want it. I want it in the elbows. Okay? Which one could you support more with? Your wrist or your elbows? Obviously your elbows. Larger bone structure, larger muscle groups. That's where we want to be absorbing that energy. So instead of here, we want it to be here. Also, watch the front sight. If I'm here, that muzzle rise, it's all over the place. I got to reacquire a sight picture every time. Versus if I'm absorbing it in my elbows, that front sight is just barely moving. Barely. And you'll hear me say to new shooters as well, you know, watch that front sight dance. Because if I'm here, it's jumping all over the place. I don't want that. I want it to be just here, just barely dancing as I shoot. So, good positive traction, friction, you know, good leverage points on the firearm, a good squeeze, good wrist and elbow positioning, and then as you go to shoot, you should be able to control that recoil much more manageably.